So moving on to the preschool stage in Erikson's model, let me just refresh your memory a bit about Erikson. Remember that he is a psychodynamic thinker, so his theory is really in the Freudian tradition. But that being said, he certainly alters some things from Freud's model. So we'll see that a little bit as we talk about his preschool stage. The preschool stage, there's only one of them. Erikson calls it initiative versus guilt. And it runs from about 3 to about 6 years of age, which, if you remember back to our very first unit, are the years of the phallic stage in Freud's model. And that's not a coincidence, and we'll talk a little bit about the overlap between Erikson's ideas and Freud's ideas in this particular stage. But let's first define what Erikson was thinking when he titled this stage Initiative versus Guilt. Initiative, the one end of the continuum that Erikson calls initiative, is really kind of like curiosity about the world and wanting to try new things. And if you think about it, although we said perhaps the favorite words of the toddler are mine and no, suggesting autonomy, perhaps the favorite word of the preschooler demonstrating initiative is why. You get lots of questions from preschoolers. Why this? Why that? Why is the sky blue? Why do I have to do that? Some of that, of course, is going to come back in adolescence as well, with a different attitude. Why do I have to do that? There are some similarities. But in any case, initiative is, in Erikson's view, a prime motive during these years. This is a desire to explore, to learn about the world, to be out there kind of, just experimenting and learning about things. The other end of the spectrum here, the other end of the continuum, is guilt, which for Erikson and for most psychologists, guilt is the feeling that we feel when we have transgressed a social boundary or kind of a moral boundary. The feeling that we feel when we have transgressed a social or moral boundary. And you can imagine that the drive towards exploring the world puts the child at risk for violating those social or moral boundaries. You can imagine, for example, going shopping. Maybe you're at a supermarket with a 4-year-old, and the 4-year-old is maybe sitting in the cart, and you're in line to check out, to buy your groceries, and there's a woman in front of you, an older woman, perhaps who had hair like my grandmother, which in the right light was downright purple. I don't know exactly what color scheme she was using or how she was getting it colored, but in certain lights it really just looked like this kind of nice lavender color. And you can imagine a 4-year-old perhaps has never seen hair like that, and the child turns to you and with a voice at full volume asks you, "Mommy or Daddy, why is that lady's hair purple?" And of course everybody hears you, including the lady, including the person who's checking groceries. And boy, that's a kind of a violation of a social boundary, right? You don't usually make comments about strangers when they're in earshot. And so depending on how a parent relates to the situation, responds to the situation, the child may develop, either perhaps a healthy sense of guilt or an unhealthy sense of guilt. If the parent responds saying, "Let's keep our voices down, we don't want to upset anybody, and maybe I'll try and answer your question, when we're in the car," that conveys to the child that there was a better way to handle it, but they're not a bad person necessarily for asking. Whereas if a parent, maybe completely ignores the child, or at the other end of the spectrum completely flies off the handle, "How could you be so rude?" asking questions like that, the child might, feel kind of, overwhelmed by how inappropriate their behavior is and feel a sense of guilt that's paralyzing. So I guess the main idea here is that how parents and teachers and other loved ones cope with the child's initiative, their exploring the world, their desire to learn things, has implications for whether or not they develop, a moderate amount of guilt that will be functional, or an overwhelming sense of guilt that's going to shut down their initiative. How is this related to Freud's stage? Well, remember that Freud said that this was the phallic stage that runs about 3 to 6 years as well, and during this stage, the child develops or goes through the Oedipal crisis. And Erikson saw that. He believed the Oedipal crisis existed, and he saw that as one example, perhaps a primary example of initiative. I mean, at the risk of sounding really crass and a bit crude, wanting to take the initiative with the opposite sex parent. Okay, and yet, as the superego develops, and remember it develops near the end of the preschool period, near the end of the Oedipal conflict, as the child identifies with the same-sex parent, as the superego develops, that moral center, that center of the morality that the child sees around him or her, there's more and more capacity for feeling guilt. All right, so Erikson based his ideas on Freud, borrowed from Freud, but as has been the case all along, every stage we've looked at in Erikson's model, Erikson's ideas are much broader and much more social and psychological rather than simply sexual/sensual like Freud's ideas were. All right, let's move on to a discussion of play. All right, a fun topic to talk about, play. Of course, kids in the preschool period, really at all periods, play because it's enjoyable. They don't think they're necessarily, gaining psychological advantage or promoting their own development. But of course, psychologists have to come in and find all the reasons that kids play. And humans are not the only ones, by the way, who play. Many other animals play as well, and really there's a lot of evidence to suggest that play in many different species plays an important role in their development. And we'll see some of that as we go through these different perspectives on play. To connect Erikson, what we just talked about, to this particular topic, one of the ways that kids explore the world and learn about the world, in other words, develop their initiative, is through play. And I think you'll probably see that as we go through some of these different perspectives. So we're going to take a look at really 4 different models. The psychoanalytic and behavioral models that you see here on the slide are pretty quick to talk about. And then the cognitive and social models or theories are a little bit more involved, so they'll have their own separate slides. But let's start with the psychoanalytic theory on play, or a psychoanalytic theory on play. Remember that psychoanalytic or psychodynamic models, value the unconscious. They believe it exists. They think some very important things happen there, including the child trying to cope with various emotions that are intimidating to the child, high levels of anxiety or anger. And the psychoanalytic model of play reflects that. In this model, play is seen as the child's tendency or attempt to gain mastery over their problems and also satisfy their wishes and desires that they might not be able to satisfy in some other way. So for example, if we have a child who, let's say it's a 3-year-old girl, and maybe she has like a 6-year-old older brother, who teases her and steals her toys and things like that. Well, as a 3-year-old female, she may not feel she can just, turn around and bop her big brother in the nose. He's probably stronger and bigger and more aggressive than she is. But what she might do is, after this next interaction with her brother that's very frustrating for her. He's stolen a toy, he's called her names, he's teased her. She might go into her room and take a teddy bear and beat that teddy bear up and call it all sorts of names. And a psychoanalytic or psychodynamic lens on that behavior, that play behavior, she's playing with this bear in this way, would see her kind of satisfying her wishes for revenge on her brother and gaining mastery in that she's kind of letting those feelings out so that she can move on beyond the feelings of anger and frustration that might be monopolizing her. It may not be surprising to you to know that psychoanalytic perspectives were really the first perspectives on which play therapy was based. Play therapy is a way that those of us in mental health do therapeutic work with kids using toys. And the first models of using play in therapy were psychoanalytic in nature. Now, there's many other models of play therapy at this point, not just psychoanalytic models, but play therapy really started in the psychoanalytic world. Some of you know it was a woman named Melanie Klein. You don't need to know her name in this class, but if and when you take History and Systems of Psychology, we will talk about her. I've put a link there to an introduction to play therapy put forth by the Association for Play Therapy here in the United States. And I would encourage you to watch it, at least to the point, oh goodness, I can't remember exactly where this happens, but about 2/3 of the way through the video, it will shift to kind of an advertisement for the Association for Play Therapy. You don't need to watch that. But the first part of it is really just kind of an explanation of play therapy, and you can see how play therapy rooms are set up, and you can see play therapists interacting with children and so forth, just to get a sense of what play therapy is. I would like you to know that not only for the purposes of the exam, to know that play therapy exists and that historically it's connected to psychoanalytic models, but I'd like for you to know that as somebody interested in psychology, and I'd like you to be familiar with it because you're going to be a parent and or a teacher and or a children's minister someday. And you may know kids who, unfortunately will need some assistance with anxiety or ADHD or because their parents are getting divorced. And a therapist who is trained in play therapy, especially if you're talking about kids, say, under 12, is really not a bad idea for kids who are struggling. So take a look at that video, just kind of get a sense of what play therapy is, and then we'll move on to the behavioral theory. Okay, so moving on. Remember that our behavioral thinkers are people like Pavlov and Skinner and Bandura, and they focus on making associations between stimuli and reinforcements and punishments and modeling social learning and so forth. And from that perspective, one of the benefits of play for kids, I guess you could call it a benefit, is that they get feedback on certain behaviors and social roles as they play. Sometimes that feedback can be useful and healthy, sometimes maybe not so much, but you can imagine that how others react to their play teaches them something. And here's an example. Let's say, we have a young boy. We'll reverse it this time. We've got a 3-year-old boy, 3 or 4-year-old boy who's got an older sister. And that older sister is in possession of an enviable Barbie collection. And this little boy sometimes has to play with her Barbie collection. And so one day when he's playing with the Barbie collection, he's got all the pink stuff out and Barbie's all dressed up. Dad happens to come home. Okay, that little boy is going to learn something very different. If Dad sees him on the floor, sees the little boy on the floor, and says, "Oh, you got the Barbies out. Hold on just a minute. Let me get dressed. Let me change my clothes, and I'll come play with you." Then if Dad comes through the door, sees the little boy on the floor with the Barbies and, blows a gasket. "What are you doing playing with the Barbies? Those are for girls. Boys don't play with dolls. Boys don't care about things like that." That child in those two different situations has learned two very different things about what's appropriate for a boy to engage in. Another way kids gain feedback, maybe you've seen them play house, or you yourself have played house, or school or something like that, and other kids will give them feedback, right? I mean, that's not what a mommy does. You can't go to work. You have to be in the kitchen cooking or something like that. Not saying that's true, but the child learns at least one perspective on being a mommy through that kind of feedback from their peers. So the behavioral emphasis in analyzing play focuses on what kids are learning through the feedback, the reinforcements, the punishments they get through the roles that they are trying to enact. Okay, and then finally take a look at cognitive and social models, but they require their own slides because they're a little bit more involved. So let's move on. All right, so moving on to the cognitive theory, because this is based, as you can probably already tell by looking at the words on the slide, because this is based on Piaget's model, we actually have kind of a developmental model, or different, I don't know if I want to call them stages, but perhaps phases of play. In other words, we're going to try to describe, based on cognitive skills, how play develops over childhood. Okay, so you see 4 different kinds of play there: functional play, constructive play, dramatic play, and games with rules, tied to the first 3 stages in Piaget's model. We've covered 2 of these stages, the sensory motor period and the pre-operational period. We'll be covering the concrete operational period in middle childhood. So let's take a look at these types of play and talk about how they might be connected to some of the skills children have cognitively at these different levels. All right, so functional play, which has been linked to Piaget's sensory motor period, is simply repeating movements. It might just be running around. It might be the young infant who seems to get a real kick out of, opening and closing their hand. So it's basically just moving one's body or maybe moving an object for the fun of it. And I think you can see the heavy motor emphasis, movement emphasis in functional play. We never really lose the capacity to play from this perspective, to engage in functional play, but it does tend to be more prevalent, really in the first year or so of life during that sensory motor period. But of course we, even as adults, we might enjoy running or something like that and consider that playful. So we don't lose the ability to play in this way. Once the pre-operational period, they tend to decrease the amount of functional play they do and increase the amount of constructive and dramatic play. Constructive play is manipulating objects to build something, to construct something. And I think if you have ever been to Toys R Us or any toy store, you are probably familiar with the many, many different things that are out there to tap into preschoolers' desire to engage in constructive play, right? I mean, Legos, what else? Lincoln Logs. I'm showing my age there. But all the stuff out there, just regular old blocks, right, that is designed to help you build, taps into constructive play. You might take a minute to just even think about what are some of the things that you liked to play with that were constructive in nature. The other type of play that's quite common in the preschool period is dramatic play, where kids pretend to be someone or something else, whether it's playing house or superheroes or animals. That kind of play is also fairly common. And one thing that is characteristic of pre-operational thinkers that probably contributes to both of these kinds of play is the role of symbolic thinking. Remember, Piaget said that one advantage that pre-operational children have over kids in the sensory motor period is that they can think symbolically. They can form mental images. They can understand that one thing can stand for another. And all of that is kind of important in both of these. I mean, in terms of constructive play, if you're building a castle out of blocks, you have to have kind of an image in your mind of what a castle is. Be able to understand that you don't necessarily have bricks in front of you, you only have blocks, but they can pretend to be bricks as you build your castle, right? The blocks stand for some other material that castles are usually built from. In terms of dramatic play, you have to have mental images or scripts in your head about how, for example, school usually goes. So you can play school. Somebody's a teacher, somebody's a student, etc. You also have to understand that certain things can be used in a pretend fashion to be other things. So you may not have a chalkboard. I guess I don't have chalkboards anymore, but you may not have a whiteboard or a smart board, to play school with, but you might be able to pin a piece of paper on the wall, and that becomes your whiteboard or your smart board. It stands for, it's kind of a symbol of the smart board or the chalkboard. So that capacity for symbolizing is probably pretty important in both constructive and dramatic play. We've also, this is a bit secondary, but we've also talked a little bit about how the line between fantasy and reality is a bit flimsy for kids in the preschool period. We talked about that particularly in the case of lying. And that probably also helps Kids can get lost in fantasy very easily at this stage, and that probably helps them play, dramatically, helps them, build amazing things that maybe don't even look like reality when they engage in constructive play. So I think you can see there's a few pre-operational characteristics that really contribute to these kinds of play. Of course, as we develop, we continue to engage in constructive and dramatic play, but they decrease a bit as a kid moves into middle childhood. We haven't talked about concrete operations yet, and I'm not going to here, but suffice it to say that as a child continues to develop cognitively, or there are certain skills they gain that makes games with rules, with some kind of structure where everybody has to kind of abide by the same, the agreements, if you will, makes those games more possible. So whether it's sports or board games or what have you, games with rules tend to be a little bit more prevalent in middle childhood. If you've ever tried to play games with rules with a preschooler, that can be kind of interesting. Often the rules mean nothing. It's pretty much all about them winning. Perhaps because of centration, they kind of can't concentrate on the rules while they're concentrating on playing the game, but they do tend to be pretty good about the rules when other people are breaking them. You can't do that, right? So games with rules often don't really go so well, especially with young preschoolers. All right, so this model, as you've seen, is based more on cognitive skills and how they might contribute to play. The next model we're going to look at, the social levels of play, are more geared towards analyzing how a child is interacting with others in their play. All right, moving on to our last model of play, social levels of play. This was a model, it's actually been around for quite some time, put together by a woman whose last name is Parton, P-A-R-T-E-N. First name, Virginia, Mildred, something like that. Anyway, it's not that important, I guess, but we'll try to give credit where credit is due as best we can. And she is, in her model, looking at tracing how kids relate to others when they play. And she actually has 6 different stages, or types, I guess you might call them, of play. But you can be grateful to God, we're only going to be dealing with 3 of those types of play. And the 3 that I've chosen are the latter 3 in her model, the ones that come at the end of the model, and they tend to be more characteristic of preschoolers. And as we go through these, note that there's kind of 2 things that she's paying attention to. One is, to what degree are children truly interacting with other kids? Okay, to what degree are they really having dialogue? Are they working together in their play? And to what degree are they actually focused on the play activity? Okay, so 2 different things. How much are they really interacting with others, and how focused are they on the play activity? And you're going to see that really in the first type of play, we've got one of those present, but not the other. In the second type of play, we've got the other present, but the first. And it's only in the last cooperative play that they really come together, which is kind of interesting. Remember when we talked about cognitive development, we talked about the idea of centration and how, preschool kids, especially younger preschoolers, have a hard time dividing their attention between, different facets of a situation. And although Parton was not trying to make use of Piaget, in fact, she did her work really only as Piaget was getting started, you see that here. It's kind of like it's not until the end that kids are able to truly socialize and truly attend simultaneously to the activity that they're working on, all at the same time. So let's see how that plays out. All right, so the first type of play we're talking about is parallel play. And you all know what parallel means from taking math or geometry, right? That's when there's no intersection, or we might say interaction, right, between lines. And that's kind of what's happening here. You've got 2 or more kids who play near one another with similar toys, but you don't have true interaction. It's possible they're completely silent, but perhaps more often than not, you get monologues or we might say private speech predominating. Okay, so an example might be you have a sandbox and you've got two kids in there and maybe they're both playing with the trucks that are in the sandbox. They're playing obviously close to each other. The sandbox, is regular size, not that big. And if you were listening in, you might hear something like this. Child one says, "My truck's really big and I'm building a big hill from the sand and it's going to go right over it." Okay? If there was true interaction, you might expect the second child to respond to that. Maybe they'd say something like, "Yeah, well, my hill's going to be bigger," or "I like that hill you're building," or "You've got a cool truck." But in parallel play, the second child, once given the chance to talk, will simply talk about whatever is on their mind. Okay? So the second child might burst out with, "I can't wait to get home tonight. My mom's making cookies and she's making my very favorite kind, chocolate chip." Okay? Two completely different topics. Okay? Probably just kind of two instances of private speech where the kids are simply talking about what's on their mind. Okay? The first case in particular, the child's narrating what they're doing. In the second case, the kid's narrating their love of cookies. Okay, so here we see, of those two things that Parton is concentrating on, social interaction and attention task, that kids are attending to their tasks here, right? They're running the trucks over the sand and building hills. Even the kid who's talking about cookies is probably still, running his truck somewhere. But they don't really have social interaction. So they're focused on the task, but not social interaction. All right, in associative play, that reverses. You've got two or more kids who are truly interacting, but are not really coordinating their activities together, not really attentive to the actual activity at hand. So you might have two kids who are sitting in a playground at a preschool, and maybe they both have a ball. And they're sitting on the ground, and maybe they're talking about, maybe they've just seen the movie Inside Out or something, and so they're talking about it. "My favorite character was Joy because she was so exciting. Really, you like Joy? My favorite character was blah, blah, blah," right? So they're really having a dialogue. They're talking about the same thing. They're responding to one another. But instead of actually playing ball, maybe they're both holding the ball in their lap, or maybe they're rolling it on the ground next to them with one of their hands. But the activity has kind of fallen by the wayside. All right, so they're focusing more on their interaction. They're associating, but they're not really focused on the activity at hand. And then finally, in cooperative play, everything comes together. You've got two or more children playing in a coordinated, goal-oriented way. If you see a full-blown instance of dramatic play where they're playing house and you're going to be mom and I'm going to be dad and this is going to be our baby, okay, I think that's a great idea. We're both going to go to work and I'm working at the hospital and you've got your job at the business. That kind of play where they're actually really attentive to their activity, but they are interacting and often interacting about the activity, is cooperative play. So finally, they've been able to attend to both elements, social interaction and the activity at the same time. You'll note there's a link there to a video. It's a short video of just kind of different vignettes of kids playing in a preschool. And I'd like you to watch it basically now, but as you watch, look for all three of these kinds of play. I think you can find them if you are real attentive. And then we'll come back here in a second and I'll tell you what I think. Have a look at the video. All right, so in that very short video, I think you, again, see at least briefly all three types of play. And basically they go, they are listed in order, I think, in which they appear. You've got kids at the very beginning, just kind of playing next to each other, doing their puzzles, right? And so, but there's not really any interaction going on. That's more parallel play. They're attending to their activity, but they're not really interacting. Then as they change puzzles, as they trade puzzles, you might have a moment you could argue is associative play. I mean, there's true interaction. Do you want this puzzle? Yeah, I'll take it. Here you go. But they're not really doing the puzzles, obviously, at that point. And then the latter scene, which dominates at the end there, is an example of cooperative play. Granted, it's an example where one person is pretty dominant, but they are all working together, and there's a little bit of interaction, verbal interaction, that shows that there is socializing going on as well.